This time it's 5 classic British motorcycles from the 1930s. There's no doubt that the 1930s was the era when the motorcycle truly came of age. Foot gear change, overhead valve, and the saddle tank were all now common features of the motorcycles of the era. And the machines were becoming much more reliable. The 1930s machines were some of the most reliable ever built because they were so understressed. If you went out for a ride, you got a blooming good chance of getting home again. And so here are 5 classic British motorcycles from the 1930s. The aerial Red Hunter. Now you could be forgiven for thinking that I may have included the Square 4 instead from this section, but in these days it was an overhead cam of 500cc or 600cc, and although surprisingly small and compact, it actually fitted the little engine into the frame previously used by a 250 single. It wasn't exactly high performing, but it was smooth and sophisticated, and attempts to set a speed record at Brooklands with a blown version came to nothing. Because by the 1930s, an overhead valve single was seen as very much the way to go. There were of course those big V-twins that other companies produced, but these were either seen as, well, sidecar tugs, or if they were used in a Sportster such as a Brough Superior, these things were expensive and quite heavy, so not the most nimble bikes available. And as the 30s progressed, improvements in chassis technologies left these big V-twins behind. Now the origins of the Red Hunter series go back to 1932 and a series of designs put forward by Val Page. These were a 250, 350 and 500cc overhead valve sporting singles, although by that point of course they weren't actually given the Red Hunter name. This would happen a few years later with the arrival of Edward Turner, the father of the Square 4. And whilst not in the purest sense an engineer, Turner did have great skills in terms of styling and understanding the market. He restyled the overhead valve models, gave them red paint jobs and chrome tanks, creating a very aesthetically pleasing range of machines. He also christened them the Red Hunter series, giving them a little bit of panache. And while this was, in reality, little more than a styling and rebranding job as we'd call it today, it was a great success. And while the range-topping Squarial was never more than a modest commercial success, the Red Hunters performed much better in the marketplace and helped to put Ariel back in the black. The Red Hunter used a 4-stroke single-cylinder engine with overhead valves. It was a 497cc with a boring stroke of 86.4 by 85. Compression ratio was just 6 to 1, although after 1954 this would be raised on later models of course. Peak power was quoted at 24 horsepower, and with the bike weighing in at 418 pounds or 190 kilos, top speed was just over 85 miles an hour. The machine had a 4-speed, foot-changed gearbox and was available in a variety of forms, including off-roader. This was one of Ariel's most popular models and would survive in the post-war era, finally going out of production as late as 1959. The Matchless Silver Hawk. Matchless was somewhat unusual in that it was based in London, far away from the Midlands where most British motorcycles are actually produced. Founded by the Collier brothers in Plumstead in 1899, the company would find early success when Charlie Collier would ride one of their machines to success at the first Isle TT, in the single-cylinder class at least, in 1907. But the company would also be well known for their V-twins. And in fact in the 1930s they would become the main supplier for engines for Brough Superior. But it was also in the 1930s they began to experiment with V-engines of a different nature, and these were single block narrow angle Vs. The first of which was the 400cc Silver Arrow. This was produced between 1929 and 1933 and used a cast iron monoblock with a V angle of just 18 degrees. Seen very much as a touring model, the 397cc engine used side valves, so produced only around 16 horsepower at 5000 rpm, and so while expensive, was in no way a sporting machine. But the machine did have rear suspension and a linked brake system. But in the tough market of the era, this expensive and fairly slow bike didn't sell especially well, and so was phased out in 1933, by which time the machine had already been joined by something rather more sporty, and this was the Silver Hawk. The Silver Hawk used a V4 engine and replaced the side valves of the Silver Arrow with a beveled gear-driven overhead cam. The V-angle was opened up a little to 26 degrees, and the engine was now of 592 cc's, with that single overhead cam using rockers to operate the valves in all 4 cylinders. The engine had a bore and stroke of 50.8 by 73, and compression ratio was 6.1 to 1. Peak power was up to 26 horsepower, so a considerable improvement over the Silver Arrow, but still not a sporting machine given the size. And the machine was commendably light at 480 pounds or 172 kilos. Despite this, top speed was just around 85 miles an hour. The machine was smooth, sophisticated and expensive, a fact which was lead to its downfall in 1935. The Velocette KSS. For those more familiar with post-war Velocettes, they'll be much more used to those high-cam overhead valve units. These began with the MOV, or if you prefer the MOV 250 of the early 30s. This bike had been introduced to replace the old GTP 2-stroke, and with a top speed of 65 to 70 was a good performer by the standards of the time. But during the 1920s, Velocette had become famous for its cami racers, and so in 1925 they did the obvious thing and introduced the KSS, which is basically a race replica. The air-cooled 4-stroke engine used a bevel drive overhead cam with exposed valve gear. The engine had a bore and stroke of 74 by 81 mm to give a capacity of 348.4 cc's. The bike had a 4-speed, foot-operated gearbox, 3-speed on the early models, a Velocette invention incidentally, and in standard Mark I state of tune produced around 19 horsepower, although even this model could be tuned to give 90 mph performance. However, the Mark II of 1935 would be substantially upgraded, and peak power for that machine would be around 25 horsepower, with the Mark II engine essentially carrying the bike through to end of production in 1948, by which point extremely high production costs had made the bike unprofitable to sell, and the machine would be replaced by the much cheaper to make Viper model, which was of course an evolution of the MOV high cam motor. The RGE Olster. This is Deb a few years ago riding a RGE 250, but this machine uses a Jap engine, and it's not at all like the RGE Olster. The Olster used an overhead valve single-cylinder engine of RGE's own design, and an engine they would market as a customer unit under the Python brand name. Overhead valve or not, however, the engine was cutting edge, because it made use of 4 valves per cylinder. Now, RGE were not the first British company to use 4 valves. That honour likely goes to the Triumph Ricky, which came out a couple of years earlier and was of course famously designed by Harry Ricardo. And indeed a number of companies, including Ariel, would produce machines with 4 valve cylinder heads during the 1930s, although RGE would be the company which persisted with the design and developed it further. The Ulster gained its name from rider Graham Walker's win at the 1928 Ulster Grand Prix, an event at which he would be the first man to post an average speed of over 80 miles an hour for the whole race. Early 4-valve RGEs had used their valves basically mounted parallel to each other, but in the Ulster the valves ran semi-radially, in essence making the engine breathe much better. The bore and stroke was 85 by 88 to give a capacity of 499 cc's. Peak power is posted in the region of 25 horsepower and top speed is around 85 miles an hour. The company was taken over by EMI in 1936, who introduced this model with a fully enclosed valve gear. But this beautifully refined model would be their last, production ending with the outbreak of World War II. The Triumph Tiger 100. When Edward Turner arrived in Triumph in the mid-30s, he did exactly what he'd done at Ariel. Essentially, He took Val Page's slightly more staid designs, redressed them in these beautiful blue and chrome paint jobs, and gave them exciting new names, in this case the Tiger range, of sporting overhead valve singles of 250, 350 and 500 cc's, creating the Tiger 70, 80 and 90 models. And so in 1938, when he introduced the Speed Twin, it seemed obvious that a more sporting model would follow, and this would be the twin-cylinder Tiger 100 of 1939. The engine of course had a 180-degree crankshaft and used internals from Val Page's earlier 250 L21 model, with a bore and stroke of 63 by 80, giving a capacity of 498 cc's. The engine was given a light tune compared to the Speed Twin, with compression ratio raised from 7.2 to just 7.75 to 1. Peak power came up from the 27 horsepower of the Speed Twin to 34 horsepower at 7,000 rpm. And as the name suggests, Triumph would claim a top speed of 100 miles an hour. One nice touch on these 39 bikes is that the rear of the exhaust can be removed, effectively creating a megaphone exhaust for racing and track work. And while Edward Turner himself was not really a fan of racing, he wasn't averse to a bit of good publicity. So one machine was used to travel from Land's End to John O'Groats, before then lapping continuously at Brooklands for 6 hours at an average speed of 78.5 miles an hour. And also at Brooklands, Freddie Clark would set a lap record of 118.02 miles an hour in 1939 on a slightly bored out Tiger 100. But then of course came World War II. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in a future video? Perhaps you got a bike we can use for a test ride? Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.